Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin when the world has already written you off. Agnes Harrow knew that feeling all too well as she sat alone on her porch, watching another sunset paint the dusty streets of Redwater. At 78, the widow had spent nearly 20 years in solitude, her only companions, the creaking of her old rocking chair and the stubborn roses growing wild along her fence. The townspeople barely noticed her anymore, just another forgotten soul waiting out her final years. Then Caleb, Bear McCord, changed everything. The 35-year-old cowboy stood 6'8", with shoulders like barn doors, and on one scorching afternoon, he walked straight up to Agnes's porch and made a shocking declaration that left the entire town speechless. He claimed she now belonged to him. The whispers started immediately. What could a young giant possibly want with an elderly widow? It wasn't her money, her land, or her late husband's belongings. What Bear wanted would prove that some treasures can't be measured in gold or property. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Agnes Harrow's days had followed the same quiet rhythm for nearly 2 decades. Each morning at dawn, she'd rise from the narrow bed she'd once shared with Samuel, wrap her faded blue shawl around her shoulders, and pad across the creaking floorboards to the kitchen. The coffee pot waited on the wood stove, a ritual as dependable as sunrise itself. By 7, she'd be settled in her rocking chair on the front porch, watching Redwater wake up around her. The chair had been Samuel's wedding gift to her 49 years ago, carved from oak he'd felled himself on their property. Its arms bore the smooth patina of decades of use, worn by her hands and his before her. Now it served as her throne and her prison, the place where she observed a world that had gradually forgotten she existed. The town stretched before her like a familiar painting, one she'd memorized in all its seasons and moods. Main Street ran straight as a rifle barrel from the train depot on the east end to the church on the west, with the general store, saloon, and sheriff's office clustered in between. Most mornings, she could predict who would emerge from which building and when. Doc Henderson always unlocked his office at exactly 8:15, his medical bag in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Mary Sullivan swept the boardwalk in front of her boarding house with military precision at 8:30, her grey hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. Agnes had been part of that choreographed dance once. Back when Samuel was alive, she'd walked those same boards with purpose, carrying fresh eggs to trade at Morrison's general store or meeting the other wives for quilting circles at the church. But widowhood had gradually erased her from the town's daily script. Now she was merely scenery, as fixed and unremarkable as the weathered hitching posts that lined the street. The isolation hadn't happened overnight. For the first few years after Samuel's passing, neighbors still stopped by with casseroles and awkward condolences. The pastor made his duty calls, sitting stiffly in Samuel's old chair while delivering platitudes about God's plan. But time had a way of smoothing over even the deepest sympathy, and eventually the visits stopped. Agnes became another of Redwater's widows, expected to fade gracefully into the background until the undertaker came calling. She kept Samuel's memory alive in small ways. His journal still lay open on the kitchen table, filled with his careful notations about cattle prices and weather patterns. His coat hung on the peg by the door, though the moths had found it years ago. Most precious of all was the leather-bound book where he documented their early years together, the journey west in 72, the back-breaking work of building their homestead, the hopes they'd nursed for children who never came. Samuel had been a meticulous record-keeper, a habit he'd inherited from his father back in Ohio. Every significant event, every family story, every piece of local history found its way into his careful script. Stories die when the people who live them die, he'd often said, usually while updating his entries by lamplight. But if we write them down, they live forever. Agnes had found comfort in those words during her loneliest moments. She'd taken to reading his entries aloud to the empty house, hearing his voice in every carefully chosen word. But as the years passed, even that comfort had begun to feel hollow. What good were preserved stories if no one remained to hear them? The roses along her fence had become her most faithful companions. Samuel had planted them their first spring on the property, choosing varieties he'd heard could survive the harsh desert conditions. Against all odds, they'd not only survived but flourished, creating a fragrant border that softened the harsh edges of their plot. Agnes tended them with religious devotion, pruning and watering and coaxing blooms from seemingly lifeless stems. They rewarded her faithfulness with explosions of color that painted her little world in shades of hope she'd almost forgotten existed. It was while tending those roses 3 months ago that she'd first noticed him. The giant cowboy had been standing across the street, his massive frame propped against the post outside Morrison's store. At first, she'd assumed he was waiting for someone or studying the job postings that Mr. Morrison tacked to his window. But when she glanced up again an hour later, he was still there, his attention seemingly focused on her modest home. Over the following weeks, she'd spotted him regularly around town. He took work where he could find it, hauling freight for the depot, helping Doc Henderson move furniture, repairing storm damage on the church roof. The townspeople treated him with the cautious politeness reserved for drifters, accepting his labor but keeping their distance. Agnes had seen enough men like him over the years to recognize the type: strong backs, calloused hands, and the restless eyes of someone always ready to move on when the work dried up or trouble found them. But something about this one was different. While other itinerant workers spent their evenings in the saloon, drinking away their wages and starting fights, this giant kept to himself. Agnes often saw him in the early morning hours, sitting alone behind the boarding house, with a book in his hands, lips moving silently as he struggled through the words. The sight stirred something in her chest that she'd thought long dead, a maternal instinct toward someone obviously trying to better himself despite the odds. She'd learned his name by accident, overhearing Mary Sullivan complain to Morrison about her newest boarder. "Caleb McCord," the woman had said, her voice carrying the particular disdain she reserved for anyone who couldn't pay their rent a week in advance, "calls himself Bear, like he's some kind of legend. Big as a barn but quiet as a mouse, keeps strange hours and asks too many questions about folks who've been dead longer than he's been alive." The name had stuck in Agnes's mind. She'd known McCords back in her younger days, good Irish stock who'd settled in the territory before the railroad came. But this Bear McCord looked to be part Indian, his features carrying the sharp angles and bronze skin that spoke of mixed heritage. In a town where bloodlines mattered almost as much as bank accounts, that combination would make him doubly an outsider. Still, there was something about the way he watched her that didn't feel intrusive or threatening. When their eyes had met across the street that first morning, he'd simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respectful acknowledgement before walking away. No leering, no calculation, just the kind of courtesy she remembered from men of Samuel's generation. As autumn settled over Redwater, Agnes found herself looking forward to those brief encounters. A nod from her porch, a tip of his hat from across the street, sometimes a quiet "Morning, ma'am," when they passed on the boardwalk. It wasn't much, but it was more human connection than she'd experienced in months. For the first time in years, someone seemed to actually see her rather than looking right through her like she was already a ghost. The town itself seemed frozen in time, resistant to the changes sweeping across the rest of the territory. While other settlements embraced progress and modernization, Redwater clung to the old ways with stubborn pride. The mayor, Jonathan Thompson, ruled with the kind of iron-fisted paternalism that brooked no dissent. Sheriff Tom Parker enforced not just the law, but the unwritten codes of social conduct that kept everyone in their proper place. Mrs. Sullivan at the boarding house served as the unofficial moral authority, her sharp tongue and sharper memory, ensuring that any deviation from accepted behavior became immediate public knowledge. In such an environment, Agnes had learned to keep her head down and her thoughts to herself. But as she rocked on her porch each morning, watching Bear McCord move through his daily routines with quiet dignity, despite the town's cold reception, she found herself remembering what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival. The irony wasn't lost on her. At 78, when most people would assume her capacity for surprise had long since withered, she was developing her first genuine curiosity about another person in 20 years. There was something about the way Bear carried himself, respectful but not subservient, strong but not aggressive, that reminded her of the best qualities she'd loved in Samuel. But Agnes had learned caution through decades of disappointment. Whatever interest she might feel toward this mysterious cowboy would remain her secret. In a town where even the slightest deviation from expected behavior became fodder for gossip, the last thing she needed was to give the busybodies more ammunition against her already precarious position in the community. As October faded toward November, she contented herself with their wordless exchanges and tried not to think about what would happen when winter arrived and work became scarce. Men like Bear McCord never stayed in places like Redwater longer than necessity required. Soon enough, he'd move on to greener pastures, and she'd return to her solitary vigil in the rocking chair. She had no way of knowing that, on a particularly warm afternoon in late November, everything would change, with 7 simple words that would shake Redwater to its very foundations. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on November 23rd, unusual for the season, but not unwelcome after a week of cold rain. Agnes had taken advantage of the warmth to air out Samuel's old quilts, hanging them on the line that stretched between 2 fence posts in her backyard. The fabric held 20 years of memories, winter nights when she'd pulled them close for comfort, lazy Sunday mornings when Samuel had insisted they stay in bed just a little longer. She was folding the last quilt when she heard the heavy footsteps on her front porch, not the quick, purposeful stride of Doc Henderson making his rounds, or the measured pace of Sheriff Parker on official business. These steps belonged to someone, much larger, moving with deliberate care, as if afraid the old boards might give way beneath their weight. Agnes smoothed her grey hair and adjusted her shawl before walking around to the front of the house. Bear McCord stood at the foot of her porch steps, his hat in his hands and his massive frame somehow managing to look humble despite its intimidating size. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his dark eyes, the premature grey threading through his black hair, the careful way he held himself like a man who'd learned to make himself smaller to avoid frightening others. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, his voice surprisingly soft for such a large man, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Agnes glanced toward town, acutely aware that several of her neighbors had found urgent reasons to sweep their porches or tend their gardens at precisely this moment. Mrs. Sullivan stood brazenly in front of her boarding house, making no pretense of doing anything other than watching the unusual scene unfold. "I suppose," Agnes replied, settling into her rocking chair with practiced dignity, "though I can't imagine what business we might have together, Mr. McCord." He climbed the steps slowly, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. Even then, the old wood groaned in protest. "I've been watching you," he said, then immediately flushed red. "I don't mean anything improper by that, Mum. It's just you're the only person in this town who looks like they've got stories worth hearing." Agnes studied his face, searching for deception or ulterior motive. She'd become skilled at reading men's intentions over the years, a necessary survival skill for a woman alone. But Bear's expression held nothing but earnest hope, mixed with obvious nervousness. "Stories," she repeated carefully. "What kind of stories?" "The real ones." He gestured toward the town spread out below them. "These folks talk about the old days like they read about them in books. But you've got the look of someone who was actually there, who saw things happen instead of just hearing about them later." A flutter of something long dormant stirred in Agnes's chest. When was the last time anyone had asked about her experiences, her memories, the life she'd lived before becoming invisible? And why would those stories matter to you? Bear looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands like a prayer wheel. I never learned to read proper until recently. Missed out on a lot of schooling when I was young. But I've been trying to catch up. And the more I read about this territory's history, the more I realize how much is getting lost. The books only tell part of the story, the part written by men who wanted to make themselves look heroic. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and Agnes saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine hunger for knowledge, the same thirst for truth that had driven Samuel to fill page after page with careful observations. I think the real stories, the ones about what it was actually like to live through those times, are disappearing with the people who lived them, and that seems like a terrible waste. Agnes felt her carefully constructed walls wavering. For 20 years, she'd carried Samuel's stories and her own like precious cargo, protecting them from a world that seemed increasingly uninterested in the past. But here was someone asking not for gossip or entertainment, but for truth. "The real stories aren't always pretty," she said quietly. "Not like in the books. I'd expect not." Bear's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen his own share of ugly truths. Pretty stories are usually lies anyway. Before Agnes could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps on gravel announced an unwelcome interruption. Sheriff Parker rounded the corner of the house, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in the way that made his meaning unmistakably clear. "Afternoon, Mrs. Harrow," Parker said, his eyes never leaving Bear's massive frame. "Everything all right here?" "Perfectly fine, Sheriff." Agnes kept her voice level, though she could feel her pulse quickening. "Mr. McCord and I were simply having a conversation." "Is that so?" Parker stepped closer, his badge catching the sunlight. He was a thin, wiry man who compensated for his lack of physical presence with an abundance of authority. "Seems like an odd pairing for conversation. You sure he's not bothering you?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. Agnes had seen this dance before, the way men like Parker used their badges to enforce not just law, but social order. Bear McCord, with his mixed heritage and drifter status, represented exactly the kind of disruption that made small-town sheriffs nervous. "Mr. McCord has been nothing but respectful," Agnes said firmly. "I'm quite capable of managing my own social interactions. Thank you." Bear had remained perfectly still during the exchange, his posture respectful but not submissive. Agnes noticed he hadn't put his hat back on, a small gesture of deference that probably saved him from a more aggressive confrontation. "Well," Parker said slowly, "just want to make sure our elderly residents aren't being taken advantage of. Lot of unsavory types drift through town this time of year, looking for easy marks before winter sets in." The insult was delivered with such casual precision that it took Agnes's breath away. In a few words, Parker had managed to paint her as a helpless victim and Bear as a potential predator, all while maintaining the pretense of protective concern. "Sheriff Parker," Agnes said, rising from her chair with as much dignity as her 78-year-old frame could muster. "I lived through the Apache raids of '74, survived 3 years of drought that killed half the cattle in this territory, and buried a husband who was worth 10 of most men walking around today. I think I can handle one polite conversation without requiring rescue." The color drained from Parker's face. Agnes rarely spoke so directly to anyone, let alone a man in authority. Her reputation as a quiet, harmless widow had just taken a significant hit, and they both knew it. "Ma'am," Bear said quietly, Perhaps you should stay exactly where you are," Agnes interrupted, surprised by the steel in her own voice, "unless you have somewhere urgent to be." Bear's eyes widened slightly, but he settled back against the porch railing. "No, ma'am, nowhere urgent at all." Parker looked between them, clearly recognizing that his intervention had backfired spectacularly. Instead of preventing an inappropriate association, he'd managed to create exactly the kind of public scene that would have every tongue in Redwater wagging before supper. "Well," he said finally, "I'll leave you to your conversation. But Mrs. Harrow, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." As Parker retreated, Agnes could see curtains twitching in windows up and down the street. By evening, Half the town would know that the quiet widow had publicly defended a drifter against the sheriff himself. The other half would know by morning. Agnes sank back into her rocking chair, suddenly aware of what she'd just set in motion. For 20 years, she'd maintained her tenuous position in Redwater through careful invisibility. Now, in the space of 5 minutes, she'd thrown that safety away for a man she barely knew. "Mrs. Harrow," Bear said gently, "I'm sorry. I never meant to cause you trouble." Agnes looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the mixed-blood drifter that others saw, but something Samuel would have recognized and respected. A man who asked difficult questions and wasn't satisfied with easy answers. Someone who understood that the most important stories were often the ones no one wanted to hear. "Mr. McCord," she said, making a decision that would change everything. "Would you like to come back tomorrow? I believe I have some stories that might interest you." The smile that spread across Bear's weathered face was worth every whisper, every sideways glance, every consequence that was sure to follow. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "I surely would." Bear returned the next morning at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying a small wooden crate and wearing the same careful expression of respectful hope. Agnes had spent the night questioning her judgment, alternating between excitement at the prospect of sharing her memories and terror at what the town's reaction might mean for her future. She'd risen early to bake biscuits, a gesture of hospitality she hadn't extended to anyone in years. The kitchen had felt different, with purpose beyond mere survival, filled with the warm scents of flour and butter and the kind of anticipation she'd almost forgotten existed. "I brought something," Bear said, setting the crate gently on the porch table. "Thought it might help with the stories." Inside, nestled in wood shavings, was a leather-bound journal and several bottles of ink. The journal's cover was unmarked, its pages cream-colored and waiting. Agnes ran her fingers over the smooth leather, remembering Samuel's careful documentation of their life together. "For writing them down," Bear explained, settling onto the top step since no chair could accommodate his massive frame. "If you're willing to share them, I'd like to preserve them proper, the way they deserve to be preserved." Agnes opened to the first page, inhaling the scent of new leather and possibility. "You said you were learning to read. Are you confident your writing is up to the task?" Bear's face reddened. "I'll do my best, Mom. And if my writing's not good enough, maybe we can find someone to help clean it up later. But I want to get the stories down first, while they're fresh from your telling." There was something deeply moving about his humility, his willingness to expose his own limitations in service of preserving her experiences. Agnes settled into her rocking chair, the journal cradled in her lap like a sleeping cat. "Where would you like me to start?" "Wherever feels right," Bear said, uncapping one of the ink bottles and selecting a pen from his shirt pocket. "Just tell me like you're telling a friend." Agnes closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back across the decades. When she spoke, her voice carried the rhythm of memory, each word carefully chosen. "I was 17 when we left Missouri. Samuel was 22, old enough to convince my father he could provide for a wife, but young enough to believe the advertisements about free land and fresh starts. We joined up with the Ketchum wagon train in Independence, 37 families all chasing the same dream." Bear's pen scratched across the paper, his brow furrowed in concentration as he struggled to keep pace with her words. Agnes slowed her cadence, giving him time to capture the details that mattered. The pamphlets made it sound like a grand adventure, rolling hills, gentle streams, fertile soil just waiting for the plow. They didn't mention the heat or the dust or the way the wheels grinding over rocks sounded like the devil's own music after the first 100 miles. As Agnes continued, describing the endless days on the trail, the careful rationing of water, the way hope and despair could alternate like sunrise and sunset, Bear's initial nervousness faded into absorbed concentration. His handwriting was crude but determined, each letter formed with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything else. "Tell me about the people," Bear said during a pause. "The other families. What were they like?" Agnes smiled, remembering faces she hadn't thought about in years. The Ketchums themselves were German stock, practical people who'd done the journey twice before as guides. Mrs. Ketchum could deliver a baby, set a broken bone, and cook a decent meal over a buffalo chip fire all in the same day. Her husband knew every waterhole between Missouri and California. She paused, studying Bear's intent expression. Most people asked about the dramatic events, Indian attacks, river crossings, the kinds of stories that made good telling around saloon tables. But Bear seemed genuinely interested in the ordinary details that made up the bulk of their experience. There was a family named Morrison, no relation to our store owner here. They had 6 children, and the youngest was just walking when we started out. Little Mary Morrison was everyone's darling, always getting passed from wagon to wagon when her parents needed rest. Bear looked up from his writing. What happened to her? Cholera, outside Fort Kearny. Took her in 2 days. Agnes's voice softened. We buried her under a cottonwood tree beside the Platte River. Her mother made a quilt from scraps of everyone's dresses to wrap her in. Said she wanted Mary to be remembered by every family on the train. As Bear carefully recorded the story, Agnes noticed tears in his dark eyes. The raw emotion surprised her. Most men would have hidden such feelings, especially from a woman they barely knew. I'm sorry, he said, wiping his face with the back of his hand. It's just, children shouldn't have to suffer like that. No, Agnes agreed quietly. They shouldn't. But suffering was part of the bargain, whether we acknowledged it or not. The trail took something from everyone who traveled it. They worked through the morning, Agnes sharing memories, while Bear documented them with increasing skill. His writing improved as he relaxed into the rhythm, and Agnes found herself remembering details she'd thought lost forever. The way her mother's wedding ring had caught the firelight during their last evening together. The sound Samuel made when he slept, exhausted from walking beside the oxen all day. The taste of the first sweet water they'd found after 3 days of alkali springs. Around noon, Sarah Mitchell appeared at the gate, carrying a covered basket and wearing the determined expression of someone on a mission of either mercy or reconnaissance. Sarah taught school in Redwater and was generally considered one of the town's more progressive residents, though that wasn't saying much in a place where progress moved at the speed of molasses. Agnes, Sarah called out, her voice carefully neutral. I brought some of those ginger snaps you used to like. Agnes recognized the gesture for what it was, an excuse to get a closer look at the mysterious relationship developing on her front porch. But Sarah had always been kind to her, even during the loneliest years, and she deserved better than suspicion. Come up, Sarah. I'd like you to meet Mr. McCord properly. Bear rose respectfully as Sarah climbed the steps, though the small porch suddenly felt crowded with his massive presence. Ma'am, he said simply, touching his hat brim. Sarah's eyes took in the journal, the ink bottles, the careful stack of written pages. Her expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching wonder. You're writing down her stories, she said, not quite a question. Yes, ma'am, with Mrs. Harrow's permission. Sarah looked between them, and Agnes could practically see the wheels turning in the schoolteacher's mind. That's wonderful. Agnes has lived through so much history. It would be a crime to let those experiences disappear. The simple validation meant more to Agnes than she would have expected. For the first time since Bear's arrival, someone else seemed to understand the value of what they were attempting. Would you like to hear some? Agnes asked impulsively. Sarah settled onto the porch railing, her basket balanced in her lap. I'd be honored. As Agnes began the story of the Morrison family again, this time with an audience of 2 hanging on every word, she felt something shift inside her chest. The isolation that had defined her existence for 20 years was cracking like ice in spring sunshine. For the first time in decades, Agnes Harrow felt truly useful. The storytelling sessions became a daily ritual that transformed the rhythm of Agnes's life. Each morning, she would prepare tea and arrange the porch chairs while Bear gathered his writing materials. The journal was filling steadily with her memories, his handwriting growing more confident with each page. But their growing friendship didn't go unnoticed by the rest of Redwater. Agnes became aware of the whispers that followed her on her rare trips to Morrison's store, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the pointed stares from neighbors who'd barely acknowledged her existence for years. "It's not natural," she overheard Mrs. Sullivan telling the pastor's wife outside the church. "A woman her age carrying on with a man young enough to be her son, and him being what he is, it's just asking for trouble." Agnes had hurried past without confronting them, but the words stung more than she cared to admit. The implication that their friendship was somehow improper made her angry in ways she hadn't felt since Samuel's death. Was it so impossible to believe that a man might value her mind rather than covet her possessions? Bear seemed oblivious to the town's growing hostility, or perhaps he'd simply learned to ignore such reactions. He arrived each morning with the same quiet dignity, listened to her stories with the same absorbed attention, and treated her with the same respectful affection that had initially won her trust. 3 weeks into their routine, Agnes made a decision that surprised them both. As Bear packed up his writing materials after a particularly emotional story about a river crossing gone wrong, she stood up from her rocking chair. "Tomorrow," she said, "I think I'll walk to town with you." Bear's eyebrows rose. "Mom, I need supplies from Morrison's, and I'm tired of timing my errands to avoid running into anyone. If people are going to talk anyway, they might as well have something real to talk about." The next morning, Agnes donned her best dress, a deep blue wool that Samuel had always said brought out her eyes, and pinned her silver hair in the style she'd worn as a young woman. When Bear arrived, his admiring smile told her the effort hadn't been wasted. "You look lovely, Mrs. Harrow." "Agnes," she corrected him, "I think we've moved past formal titles, don't you?" They walked slowly down Main Street, Bear shortening his stride to match her more careful pace. Agnes was acutely aware of the attention they attracted, windows filling with curious faces, people stepping out of doorways to get a better look. But instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable, she found herself standing straighter, her chin lifted with something approaching defiance. At Morrison's store, the reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. The cluster of women examining fabric near the counter fell silent as Agnes entered with Bear beside her. Mr. Morrison himself emerged from the back room, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes watchful. "Mrs. Harrow," Morrison said, "what can I do for you today?" "I need flour, sugar, and coffee," Agnes replied, matching his formal tone. "And I'd like to introduce my friend, Mr. McCord. He's been helping me with some writing projects." The word friend landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled women. Mrs. Sullivan actually gasped, pressing her hand to her chest as if Agnes had announced something scandalous. Bear touched his hat brim politely. "Ladies, Mr. Morrison." The silence stretched uncomfortably until young Jenny Morrison, the store owner's daughter, broke it with genuine curiosity. "What kind of writing, Mrs. Harrow? Are you working on a book?" Agnes felt a warm surge of affection for the girl, who'd always been brighter and more open-minded than her peers. "Something like that. Mr. McCord is helping me preserve some of the old stories about this territory, things that happened before most of you were born." "That sounds fascinating," Jenny said, ignoring her father's warning look. "I'd love to hear some of them sometime." "So would I," added a voice from the back of the store. Agnes turned to see Doc Henderson emerging from behind a display of patent medicines, his weathered face bright with interest. "I've been in this territory for 30 years, but I know there's a lot of history I never heard about." The unexpected support from 2 respected community members shifted the atmosphere slightly. While Mrs. Sullivan and her allies continued to radiate disapproval, others seemed genuinely intrigued by the idea of preserved local history. As Morrison gathered her supplies, Agnes noticed Bear examining a small display of books near the counter. His attention was focused on a primer designed for teaching children to read, his fingers tracing the simple illustrations with obvious longing. "That's a good choice," Agnes said quietly, loud enough for others to hear. essential for anyone serious about improving their writing skills. Bear's face reddened, but he nodded. Yes, ma'am. Still working on getting better. The admission of his literacy struggles, delivered without shame in front of the town's most prominent gossips, was an act of courage that Agnes found deeply moving. Rather than hide his limitations, Bear was willing to expose them in pursuit of something more important. Education is a lifelong endeavor, Doc Henderson observed, joining their conversation. I still study medical journals from back east, trying to keep up with new discoveries. Nothing shameful about wanting to learn. On the walk home, Agnes felt lighter than she had in years. The expedition to town hadn't been the disaster she'd feared. Yes, some people disapproved, but others had shown genuine interest in their project. Most importantly, she'd reclaimed a piece of her independence, refusing to hide from the judgmental stares that had kept her isolated for so long. Thank you, Bear said as they reached her gate. For what? For defending me in there, for not being ashamed to be seen with me. Agnes stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the afternoon light, she could see the vulnerability behind his careful composure, the lifetime of rejection and judgment that had taught him to expect the worst from people. Bear McCord, she said firmly, any woman would be proud to call you friend. The fact that some people in this town are too narrow-minded to see your worth says everything about them and nothing about you. That evening, Agnes sat on her porch, with Samuel's old journal open in her lap. She'd been reading his entries about their courtship, remembering the way he'd pursued her with patient determination, despite her father's initial objections. Samuel had been an outsider too, in his way an educated man in a community that valued physical strength over book learning, a dreamer in a place that demanded practical skills. Now, decades later, she found herself in the unexpected position of being the one offering acceptance to someone society deemed unworthy. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the opportunity. For the first time since Samuel's death, she had the chance to be more than just a passive observer of life. As she prepared for bed that night, Agnes caught sight of herself in the old mirror above her dresser. The woman looking back at her was still elderly, still weathered by years of hardship and loss. But there was something new in her eyes, a spark of purpose that had been missing for far too long. Tomorrow, she would tell Bear about the time she'd helped a runaway slave family reach the next station on the Underground Railroad. It was a story she'd never shared with anyone, not even Samuel. But it was also a story that needed to be preserved, a reminder that courage could bloom in the most unexpected places. And perhaps, in the telling of it, she would remember what it felt like to be brave. December brought the first serious cold snap, and with it, a shift in the nature of Agnes and Bear's relationship. The porch became too frigid for comfortable conversation, so their sessions moved inside to Agnes's front parlor. The intimacy of the smaller space, warmed by the crackling fire in Samuel's old stone hearth, created an atmosphere that encouraged deeper confidences. Bear had been practicing his letters diligently, working through the primer Agnes had insisted on buying for him, despite his protests about the expense. His handwriting, while still crude, had developed a distinctive character that Agnes found oddly endearing. More importantly, his growing confidence with written words had begun to unlock stories from his own past. I was born in a soddy outside Dodge City, he told her one grey afternoon, his massive hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. My mother was Kiowa, my father, Irish. Neither family wanted anything to do with the mix, so we lived by ourselves on the edge of nowhere. Agnes nodded encouragingly while darning one of Samuel's old socks. The domestic task kept her hands busy while her mind focused on Bear's halting revelations. She'd learned that he shared his stories more freely when she appeared occupied with other things, as if the lack of direct eye contact made the painful memories easier to bear. Ma died when I was 12. Fever took her in 3 days. After that, it was just me and the land until I was big enough to hire out for work. The stark simplicity of his childhood stood in sharp contrast to Agnes's own sheltered upbringing as a merchant's daughter in Missouri. Yet she recognized something familiar in the way he spoke about early loss, the careful emotional distance that came from learning too young that the people you loved could disappear without warning. "Did you ever try to find your father's people?" she asked gently. Bear shook his head. "Ma told me he went back to Ireland before I was born. Said he was a good man who just couldn't handle the way people looked at his family out here. I used to imagine him coming back for us, but eventually I stopped believing in things like that." Agnes felt a sharp pang of sympathy for the boy he'd been, abandoned by circumstances beyond his control, and forced to make his own way in a world that judged him for accidents of birth. No wonder he approached relationships with such careful humility. He'd learned early that acceptance was a gift that could be withdrawn without notice. Their storytelling sessions had taken on a new dimension as Bear's literacy improved. He began asking more sophisticated questions, probing beneath the surface of her memories to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. His outsider's perspective often revealed patterns and meanings that Agnes herself had missed. "When you tell about the wagon train," he said one morning while reviewing the previous day's writing, "you always mention how people helped each other through the hard times. But you never talk much about what happened when you reached Oregon territory. Did that cooperation just end?" Agnes paused in her knitting, struck by the insight. "You're right. Once we reached our destinations, families scattered to their individual claims. The bonds that had kept us alive on the trail seemed to dissolve once we didn't need each other for survival anymore." "Seems like a waste," Bear observed. "All that trust and cooperation, just abandoned when it might have made the building easier too." These conversations often extended far beyond the morning hours Agnes had initially planned to dedicate to storytelling. Bear would arrive before dawn and stay through the afternoon, helping with household tasks that had become difficult for her aging body. He repaired loose boards on the porch, split kindling for the fireplace, and organized Samuel's old tools in the barn. In return, Agnes mended his shirts, taught him to read Samuel's journal entries aloud, and gradually drew him into the kind of domestic routine that neither of them had experienced in years. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely in peaceful isolation, but Redwater's tolerance for their friendship was wearing thin. The first serious warning came in the form of an unsigned note slipped under Agnes's door on a particularly bitter morning in mid-December. "Some folks think you're making a fool of yourself with that half-breed drifter," the crude handwriting read. "Decent women your age should know better than to shame their late husband's memory with such carrying on. Consider this friendly advice before things get unpleasant." Agnes showed the note to Bear when he arrived for their morning session. She watched his face harden as he read the ugly words, his jaw tightening with suppressed anger. "Maybe I should find somewhere else to stay," he said quietly. "I never wanted to bring trouble on you." "Absolutely not." Agnes's response surprised them both with its vehemence. "I won't be bullied by cowards who haven't the courage to sign their names to their threats. Samuel would be ashamed of me if I let fear drive away the best friend I've had in 20 years. But even as she spoke the brave words, Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. The note represented more than simple disapproval. It was a promise of escalation if she didn't conform to the town's expectations. In a place like Redwater, social pressure could quickly turn into something more dangerous. Their concerns proved justified 3 days later when Agnes discovered that someone had scattered her carefully tended rose bushes during the night. The plants lay torn and broken in the snow, their roots exposed to the killing frost. It was the kind of petty vandalism designed to send a message without crossing the line into outright criminality. Bear found her crying over the destroyed garden when he arrived that morning, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter wind. Without a word, he began gathering the scattered plants, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he examined each root system for signs of life. "Some of these might survive if we get them replanted quickly," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The ground's not frozen solid yet. They spent the morning in the backyard, Bear digging new holes while Agnes salvaged what she could from the destruction. Working together in the bitter cold, they managed to save nearly half the bushes. It was exhausting work for a woman of 78, but Agnes refused to give up on the living symbols of her life with Samuel. "Why roses?" Bear asked as they finished the last planting. "Seems like a hard flower to grow in this climate." Agnes leaned heavily on the shovel, watching him pack soil around the final transplant. "Samuel said they reminded him of me. Beautiful but tough, able to bloom even in harsh conditions. He planted them our first spring here, when we barely had money for food, because he wanted me to have something lovely to look at during the difficult times." The memory brought fresh tears, and Bear's expression softened with understanding. "They'll grow back," he said firmly. "Might take a season or two, but roses are survivors, just like the woman who tends them." That afternoon, Sarah Mitchell arrived with a casserole and obvious concern. She'd heard about the vandalism through the town's efficient gossip network and wanted to offer what support she could. "I'm sorry this is happening," Sarah said, settling into Samuel's old chair while Agnes served coffee. "Not everyone in town feels this way about your friendship with Mr. McCord. Some of us think what you're doing preserving those stories is important work." "Important enough to speak up for?" Agnes asked pointedly. Sarah's face reddened. "I want to. It's just I have my teaching position to consider. If the school board decides I'm supporting inappropriate behavior..." Agnes nodded, understanding the practical constraints that governed a single woman's life in a small town. Sarah's support had to remain largely private to protect her livelihood. It was a compromise that left Agnes feeling more isolated than ever, despite the genuine sympathy it represented. As winter deepened and the harassment continued, more anonymous notes, meaningful stares, pointedly cold. Treatment at the general store. Agnes began to understand that her simple friendship with Bear McCord had become something larger in the town's collective mind. It represented a challenge to established hierarchies, a suggestion that worth might be measured by character rather than bloodline or social position. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, as she sat by the fire that night, reading over Bear's carefully documented stories, Agnes felt something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death, the satisfaction of taking a stand for something that mattered. Tomorrow, she would tell Bear about the collection of arrowheads Samuel had found on their land, and the Kiowa chief who'd helped them locate water during their first drought. It was a story that would challenge Redwater's comfortable assumptions about the territory's history, and she was looking forward to the telling. The arrowheads lay spread across Agnes's kitchen table like fragments of a forgotten conversation. Samuel had collected them over the years, finding them while ploughing or after heavy rains washed the topsoil from their land. Each point was carefully shaped, evidence of the skilled hands that had created tools for survival in this harsh landscape. Bear handled them with reverence, his dark eyes studying the intricate napping patterns that marked different tribal traditions. "These are old," he said softly. "Some of them maybe 100 years or more." "Samuel always said this land held memories in every stone," Agnes replied, settling into her chair with the bundle of letters she'd been hesitant to share. "But the arrowheads weren't the most important thing he found here." She gestured toward the small wooden box that had sat unopened on her mantel for 20 years. "That contains something I've never shown anyone. Samuel made me promise to keep it safe, but I think it's time." Bear watched as Agnes retrieved the box, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of items that seemed to glow with historical significance. A beaded necklace, a small silver cross, and most striking of all, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been white. "These belonged to Chief Running Bear of the Kiowa," Agnes said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel's journals mention him, but they don't tell the whole story." The summer of our third year here, when the drought was so bad that even the old-timers were talking about abandoning their claims, this man saved our lives. Bear's eyes widened as he processed not just the story, but the name. Running Bear, he repeated slowly. The resemblance struck me the first time I saw you, Agnes admitted. Not just the physical features, but something about the way you carry yourself. Samuel always said Running Bear had the most dignified bearing of any man he'd ever met, Indian or white. She lifted the letters carefully, their paper brittle with age. These are love letters between Running Bear and a white woman named Catherine Morrison, yes, from the same family as our store owner. She was a teacher who came west in 1869, full of ideas about civilizing the frontier. But instead of changing the people she met, she fell in love with one of them. Bear leaned forward, his massive frame suddenly tense with interest. What happened to them? That's the tragedy and the miracle both, Agnes continued, unfolding one of the letters to reveal elegant handwriting in fading brown ink. They couldn't marry legally, of course, but they found ways to be together, and Catherine learned to move between two worlds. She taught English to Kiowa children while Running Bear showed her how to read the land itself. Agnes paused, studying Bear's face for his reaction to this story that challenged everything Redwater claimed to believe about its past. When the drought hit, Running Bear came to Samuel in secret, told him about a hidden spring in the canyon north of here, said his people had used it for generations during dry spells. But he asked for something in return. What? Safe passage for his band through our property when the soldiers came hunting. This was 1875, remember. The Indian wars were winding down, but there was still plenty of killing being done on both sides. Bear nodded, understanding the historical context. The 1870s had been a time of brutal transition, when the last free native tribes were being forced onto reservations through a combination of warfare and starvation. Samuel agreed, Bear asked, without hesitation, said any man who'd share water in a drought year was a man worth trusting with your life. Agnes smiled at the memory. Running Bear was true to his word about the spring, and Samuel was true to his about the safe passage. 3 times that winter, Kiowa families moved through our land under cover of darkness, heading for sanctuary in the territories where the soldiers couldn't follow. She handed Bear one of the letters, its contents written in Catherine's careful script. This one's from the spring of 1876. Catherine was pregnant by then, living with Running Bear's band, but maintaining her teaching position through a complicated web of lies and alibis. Bear read slowly, his lips moving silently as he worked through the more difficult words. Agnes waited patiently, remembering her own struggles with Samuel's sometimes elaborate prose in his early journals. She's writing about the baby, Bear said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Says she hopes the child will be a bridge between worlds, able to live in both, but accepted by neither. The baby was a boy, Agnes said softly, born in late summer, healthy and strong. Catherine named him Caleb, after her father back east. The revelation hit Bear like a physical blow. His hands began to shake as he set the letter down, his dark eyes wide with shock and dawning understanding. My grandmother, he whispered. She used to tell me stories about my grandfather, said he was a chief who loved a white teacher. But I always thought they were just stories, the kind of tales you tell children to make them feel special. Agnes reached across the table to cover his trembling hands with her own weathered ones. Your grandmother was Catherine Morrison McCord. She took Samuel's family name when she married Running Bear in a Kiowa ceremony. These letters, some of them are from her to Running Bear, some from him to her during the times they had to be apart. Bear stared at the collection of artifacts with new eyes, seeing not just historical curiosities, but pieces of his own family's hidden legacy. She died when I was 8, he said slowly. Never told me about the letters, the proof. She probably didn't know Samuel had kept them, Agnes explained. After Running Bear was killed in a skirmish with cavalry in 1878, Catherine came to us half mad with grief, carrying you as a baby. She lived with us for 2 years while she pulled herself together, and Samuel became like a grandfather to you. But when she remarried and moved to Dodge City, she thought it was safer to leave the past buried. The kitchen fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of wind around the windows. Bear sat motionless, processing the revelation that Agnes was not just a friend, but a connection to the family history he'd thought lost forever. "Why tell me this now?" he asked finally. Agnes smiled, feeling the weight of 20 years of secrets lifting from her shoulders. "Because those stories you've been helping me preserve, they're not just my stories anymore. They're yours too. And because Samuel always said that a man has a right to know where he comes from, even if the knowing brings pain along with the truth." She gestured toward the box with its precious contents. "This all belongs to you now. The letters, the necklace, everything Catherine left behind. But more than that, you belong here, Bear McCord. Not as a drifter or an outsider, but as family, as the grandson Samuel never got to see grow up." Bear's eyes filled with tears that he didn't bother to hide. For 35 years, he'd carried the burden of not belonging anywhere, of being too Indian for white society and too white for the reservations. Now, in this small kitchen warmed by an old woman's courage, he'd found something he'd stopped believing existed, a place where his mixed heritage was not a liability, but a bridge to understanding. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Agnes, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Agnes replied firmly. "You need to help me finish what we started. Because now, it's not just about preserving stories for posterity. It's about making sure the next generation knows the truth about this place, about the people who built it together despite all the forces trying to keep them apart." Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Redwater in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. But inside Agnes's kitchen, surrounded by the artifacts of a love that had transcended racial boundaries and social conventions, 2 unlikely friends planned to challenge a town's comfortable lies with the inconvenient power of truth. The discovery of Bear's true heritage should have brought them closer together, but instead it seemed to create a strange distance between them. In the days following Agnes's revelation, Bear became almost formal in his interactions, as if the knowledge that they were connected by more than friendship had somehow complicated their easy camaraderie. Agnes noticed the change immediately. Where once Bear had moved through her home with comfortable familiarity, now he hesitated before touching anything, asked permission for actions that had become routine. The easy flow of conversation that had characterized their storytelling sessions grew stilted, interrupted by long pauses and careful word choices. "You don't have to treat me like fine china," Agnes finally said one morning when Bear had asked for the 3rd time if he could move a chair closer to the fire. "Learning about your grandmother's connection to Samuel doesn't change who we are to each other." But Bear's expression suggested otherwise. "It changes everything," he said quietly. "Don't you see? I came here under false pretenses, made you think I was just some drifter interested in your stories, when all along I had a connection to your family." Agnes set down her knitting with more force than necessary. "Caleb McCord, that's the most foolish thing I've heard from you yet. You didn't know about the connection any more than I did. How could you come here under false pretenses when you were ignorant of the truth yourself?" But Bear's guilt ran deeper than logic could reach. That evening, Agnes discovered why when she found him in Samuel's old workshop behind the house, hunched over a pile of documents by lamplight. The papers were scattered across the workbench in careful piles: land deeds, property surveys, tax records. "What are you doing out here?" Agnes asked, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. Bear looked up with the expression of a man caught in the act of theft. "Research," he admitted reluctantly. "I've been looking into the property records for this area, trying to understand the legal history of the land transfers." Agnes moved closer, studying the documents with growing unease. Most were official papers she recognized from Samuel's own files, but others bore the stamps and seals of territorial courts, banks, and government offices. Where did you get these? Some from the courthouse, some from the bank. Bear's voice carried the weight of confession. I've been gathering them for weeks, ever since I first came to town. It wasn't about the stories at first, Agnes. It was about the land. The admission hit Agnes like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. All her fears about Bear's motives came flooding back, made worse by the recent intimacy of their friendship. You're after my property, she said flatly. No. Bear's response was immediate and vehement. It's not what you think. Let me explain. But Agnes was already backing toward the door, her heart hammering with betrayal and disappointment. All this time, the stories, the friendship, it was all just a way to get close to me, to gain my trust so you could figure out how to take what's mine. Agnes, please, get out. The words came out as a whisper, but they carried the force of a shout. Get off my land and don't come back. Bear rose from the workbench, his massive frame suddenly seeming more threatening than protective. If you'll just let me explain. Explain what? How you've been lying to me for months, how you used my loneliness against me. Agnes's voice cracked with pain. I trusted you. I shared things with you that I'd never told another living soul. And I treasure every story you've told me, Bear said desperately. That part was never a lie, never false. Your stories, your friendship, they changed my life. But Agnes was already walking away, her dignity the only thing she had left to protect. Be gone by morning, she called over her shoulder. If I see you on my property after sunrise, I'll have Sheriff Parker arrest you for trespassing. She spent the night in Samuel's old chair by the fire, staring at the flames and feeling every one of her 78 years settling into her bones like lead weights. The house felt hollow without Bear's presence, empty in ways it hadn't been even during the loneliest years of her widowhood. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have believed that a man like Bear McCord would be interested in her stories, her friendship, her company for its own sake? The town gossips had been right all along. She was a foolish old woman, making a spectacle of herself, with a man young enough to be her son. But even as she nursed her anger and humiliation, part of Agnes's mind kept circling back to Bear's desperate expression, the genuine panic in his voice when she'd accused him of betrayal. There had been something in his reaction that didn't fit the profile of a calculating conman. If he'd been after her land all along, why look so genuinely shocked when she'd figured it out? Dawn was breaking over Redwater when Agnes finally allowed herself to examine the question that had been nagging at her all night. Why would Bear want her property in the first place? Her homestead was small and far from town, the soil decent but not exceptional, the house old and in need of repairs she couldn't afford. Compared to the larger spreads closer to the railroad, her land was hardly a prize worth an elaborate deception. Curiosity finally overcame pride, and Agnes found herself walking back to the workshop as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. The documents Bear had been studying were still scattered across the workbench, and in the morning light she could read them more clearly. What she discovered made her legs weak with shock. The papers weren't about her land specifically, they were about the entire northern section of Redwater Township, including her property, but extending far beyond it. Survey maps, mineral rights assessments, railroad development plans, and at the center of it all, a legal document that made Agnes sink into Samuel's old chair with the weight of revelation. Samuel's will, filed with the territorial court 3 months before his death, contained a clause she'd never seen before. In the event of her death without heirs, her property was to be transferred not to the town or sold at auction, but to any surviving descendant of Running Bear of the Kiowa Nation, in recognition of services rendered and friendship freely given. Agnes read the passage 3 times before its full meaning sank in. Samuel had known about Bear's heritage. Somehow, in the months before his death, her husband had discovered the truth about Catherine's child and made legal provisions for his return. The land wasn't just Agnes's property, it was Bear's inheritance, held in trust until he could be found and identified. But if Bear was the legal heir, why the secrecy? Why the research and the careful documentation instead of simply presenting his claim through official channels? The answer came in the form of another document, this one bearing the seal of the Federal Department of the Interior. A notice of pending land acquisition, dated just 2 months ago, declaring the government's intention to purchase the entire northern township for railroad development. The compensation offered was generous, far more than the land would bring at private sale. Agnes felt the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. If Bear claimed his inheritance now, he would become the legal owner just in time to sell to the government for a substantial profit. But if Agnes died without heirs, the property would pass to him anyway, and the federal buyers would never know about the complicated history that gave him legitimate claim to the land. Someone was coming up the path from the house. Agnes looked up to see Bear approaching slowly, his hat in his hands, and his expression carrying the weight of a man preparing for execution. "I know you told me to leave," he said from the doorway, "but I couldn't go without telling you the truth. All of it." Agnes gestured toward the scattered documents. "I think I've figured out most of it myself. The question is, what do you intend to do now?" Bear stepped into the workshop, his movements careful and deliberate. "That depends on whether you'll listen to what I have to say, because the story's more complicated than what those papers tell you." Agnes studied his face, searching for signs of deception or calculation. What she saw instead was a man struggling with a burden he'd carried alone for far too long. "I'm listening," she said quietly. Bear pulled up another chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking far older than his 35 years. "My grandmother died when I was 8, but before she passed, she made me promise to find you someday. Said there were debts that needed to be repaid, stories that needed to be preserved. She gave me Samuel's name and told me to look for the woman with the rose garden who'd been kind to her when the whole world seemed against her." He paused, gathering his courage for the most difficult part of the confession. "It took me 27 years to keep that promise. 27 years of working my way across half the country, following leads and dead ends, until I finally tracked you to Redwater. By then, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing was just a dying woman's fever dreams." Agnes felt her anger beginning to shift into something more complex. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. "And the land records. When I learned about the government's plans to buy up the township, I got scared," Bear admitted. "Scared that I'd finally found you, only to lose you to some federal development scheme. So I started researching, trying to understand what legal protections you might have." He gestured toward Samuel's will. "When I found this, I didn't know what to think. Samuel had left the land to my family, but you'd been living here as if it was yours for 20 years. I needed to understand the situation before I said anything that might hurt you or complicate your life." Agnes stared at the will in her hands, seeing Samuel's careful handwriting in a new light. Her husband had known about Catherine's child, had known that someday Bear might return to claim his heritage. But he'd also known that Agnes would need the security of the homestead during her lifetime. "You could have claimed the land months ago," she said slowly. "Could have had me evicted and sold to the government for a fortune." "I could have," Bear agreed. "But that would have meant betraying everything my grandmother taught me about honor, everything Samuel meant when he wrote that will. The land may be my inheritance, but you're the one who's earned the right to it through 40 years of hard living." The workshop fell silent except for the distant sound of the wind through the cottonwoods. Agnes looked at the man who had changed her life so completely in just a few months, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a potential threat or a romantic fantasy, but as the complicated, honorable person he actually was. "So what happens now?" she asked. Bear's smile was sad but genuine. "Now we figure out how to honor both Samuel's intentions and your grandmother's dying wish. Together, if you'll have me, as partners in preserving the truth, whatever the cost." The revelation about Samuel's will transformed everything between Agnes and Bear, but it also created new complications neither of them had anticipated. As they sat in the workshop surrounded by the evidence of Bear's research, Agnes felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just their own futures, but the entire trajectory of Redwater's development. "Show me exactly what the government is planning," Agnes said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. Bear spread out the survey maps and development plans across the workbench. The scope of the federal project was staggering. The entire northern section of the township, including Agnes's homestead and 5 neighboring properties, would be acquired for a new railroad depot and switching yard. The compensation offered was generous, but the human cost would be devastating for the families who'd spent decades building their lives on the condemned land. "They're moving fast," Bear explained, tracing the proposed timeline with his finger. "Formal acquisition proceedings begin in 6 months. Anyone who doesn't accept their initial offer will face eminent domain proceedings that could drag on for years with uncertain outcomes." Agnes studied the maps with growing unease. The government's plans would destroy not just homes and farms, but the delicate ecosystem of relationships that had defined this part of the territory for generations. "Have they approached you about selling?" "Not yet. They probably don't know about Samuel's will. It was filed with the territorial court, not the county records they'd typically search." Bear paused, his expression troubled. "But they'll find out eventually, and when they do, they'll expect me to be more amenable to selling than an elderly widow who spent her whole adult life on the land." The implications hung heavy between them. Bear could claim his inheritance, sell to the government, and walk away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Agnes would receive nothing beyond what federal law required for displaced residents, a fraction of the land's true value. "There's something else," Bear said reluctantly. "Something I discovered yesterday that changes the whole situation." He pulled out a map that looked different from the others, older, hand-drawn rather than formally surveyed. The lines and notations were in Samuel's careful script, documenting geographic features with the precision of someone who'd walked every inch of the territory. "This was tucked inside Samuel's will," Bear explained. "It's a map to something he called the final testimony evidence he said would prove the true history of this area's settlement." Agnes leaned closer, recognizing Samuel's handwriting, but not the locations marked on the map. The drawing showed a series of landmarks leading to a spot roughly 2 miles north of her property, in the canyon where Running Bear had shown them the hidden spring all those years ago. "He buried something there," she said with sudden certainty. "Samuel was always talking about preserving the truth for future generations, but I thought he meant his journals and letters." "I think he meant those too," Bear replied. "But this suggests something more comprehensive. Look at the date." Agnes examined the notation in the corner of the map. Samuel had drawn it just weeks before his death, when he was already too weak to leave the house without assistance. He must have buried it earlier, maybe years earlier, and made the map when he realized he was dying. They spent the morning studying Samuel's cryptic notations, trying to decode his system of landmarks and measurements. The map showed a clear path from the old spring to a location marked only with the symbol of a cross and the words, "Truth buried here, 1879. "We have to find it," Agnes said finally. "Whatever Samuel hid there, it's important enough that he went to enormous trouble to preserve it and leave us clues to its location." Bear nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Agnes, I need you to understand what we're risking here. If we find evidence that challenges the government's development plans, or if we uncover something that contradicts the official version of this area's history, we'll be going up against forces much more powerful than Redwater's gossips." Agnes felt a familiar surge of the determination that had carried her across the plains as a young bride and sustained her through decades of hardship. Samuel didn't preserve something in secret just to have it stay hidden forever. If he thought the truth was worth protecting, then it's worth discovering. They made plans to search for Samuel's cache the next day, but first they had to address the more immediate crisis facing them. Word of Bear's research had somehow leaked into the town's gossip network, and the implications were spreading like wildfire through Redwater's social hierarchy. The confrontation came that very afternoon in the form of an official visit from Mayor Thompson, accompanied by Sheriff Parker and 3 members of the town council. Agnes watched them approach from her front porch, their formal procession a stark contrast to the casual friendliness that had once characterized her relationship with the community. "Mrs. Harrow," Mayor Thompson began without preamble, "we need to discuss this situation with your companion." The word was delivered with the kind of distaste usually reserved for discussing vermin infestations. Agnes remained seated in her rocking chair, projecting calm she didn't feel, while Bear stood protectively nearby. "I'm not sure what situation you're referring to, Mayor Thompson. Don't play games with us, Agnes." The familiar form of address, coming from a man who'd barely acknowledged her existence for years, felt more insulting than formal courtesy would have been. "Word is this: Drifter's been poking around in property records, asking questions about land ownership and inheritance claims." Bear stepped forward, his massive presence a reminder that he wasn't intimidated by their official authority. "I've been researching public records that are available to any citizen. There's nothing illegal about that." "Maybe not illegal," Sheriff Parker interjected, "but it's suspicious as hell. Man like you, no roots, no family, suddenly developing an interest in local property law, right when the federal government's looking to buy up land." Agnes felt her temper rising at the thinly veiled racism in Parker's tone, but Bear's hand on her shoulder counseled patience. He was right. Losing control now would only give their opponents ammunition to use against them. Councilman Morrison, the current store owner's father, and a cousin of the Morrison family, Agnes had known on the wagon train, cleared his throat importantly. "Mrs. Harrow, we're here as friends, trying to protect you from making a serious mistake. This man has obviously targeted you because of your isolated situation and advanced age." "Targeted me for what, exactly?" "Your property, obviously," Thompson replied impatiently. "An elderly widow, living alone, no children to look out for her interests. You're exactly the kind of victim these land speculators prey upon." Agnes rose from her chair with as much dignity as her aging joints would allow. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs. Mr. McCord is a friend who's been helping me preserve some family history. Nothing more, nothing less." "Family history?" Morrison's eyebrows rose skeptically. "What family history could you possibly share with a half-breed drifter?" The slur hung in the air like a challenge. Agnes saw Bear's jaw tighten, but he maintained his careful composure. She, however, had reached the limits of her diplomatic patience. "The history of families like yours, Mr. Morrison," she said coldly. "Families who've conveniently forgotten the debts they owe to people they now consider beneath their notice." Thompson stepped forward, his political instincts recognizing the potential for escalation. "Mrs. Harrow, we didn't come here to argue about ancient history. We came to warn you that certain forces are moving to acquire property in this area, and we don't want to see you taken advantage of." "What forces?" "The federal government for one, railroad development for another." Thompson's voice carried the weight of inside knowledge. "There are opportunities coming that could benefit long-time residents of this community, but only if we present a united front in negotiations." Agnes understood the subtext immediately. The town's leadership had advanced knowledge of the government's acquisition plans and wanted to control how the process unfolded. Her property, with its strategic location and potential complications from Bear's presence, represented a wild card they couldn't afford. "And what would this united front require from me?" "Cooperation," Parker said bluntly. "No more entertaining questionable visitors, no more stirring up trouble with old stories that might complicate legal proceedings." Agnes looked at the 5 men arrayed before her, representatives of everything that had made her feel invisible and insignificant for the past 20 years. Their offer of protection came with strings attached that would require her to abandon the first meaningful relationship she'd formed since Samuel's death. "Gentlemen," she said finally, "I appreciate your visit, but I'm afraid I must decline your offer of cooperation. Mr. McCord and I will continue our historical research, and I will continue to receive whomever I choose in my own home." Number. The rejection hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Thompson's face darkened with the kind of anger that came from having one's authority publicly challenged by someone presumed to be powerless. "You're making a mistake, Agnes," he said quietly. "A serious mistake that you may come to regret." After they left, Agnes and Bear sat in her kitchen, both understanding that they'd crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The town's leadership had revealed their hand, making clear that Agnes's friendship with Bear was seen as more than a social impropriety. It was a threat to their plans for controlling Redwater's future. "Tomorrow we find Samuel's cache," Agnes said firmly. "Whatever he buried out there, it's the key to everything. And I have a feeling we're going to need every advantage we can get." Bear nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Agnes, once we open this door, there's no going back. Are you sure you're ready for what we might find?" Agnes looked around the kitchen where she'd spent 40 years of her life, at the chairs where she and Samuel had planned their future, at the windows that framed the roses he'd planted as symbols of their enduring love. Everything she'd built here was under threat, but for the first time in 20 years, she felt truly alive. "I'm ready," she said. "Samuel didn't preserve the truth, just to have it stay buried forever, and neither will I." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising a hard rain that would wash the winter's accumulated dust from the air. But inside Agnes's kitchen, two unlikely allies prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just their own futures, but the fate of everything Samuel and Running Bear and Catherine Morrison had worked to build in this harsh but beautiful land. The truth, whatever it cost to uncover, was worth fighting for. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke, just as Agnes and Bear reached the hidden spring in the canyon north of her property. Rain drummed against the rocks with increasing intensity, turning the dusty trails into treacherous streams of mud and making their search for Samuel's cache both urgent and dangerous. Bear had insisted on bringing rope and a lantern, wise precautions given the deteriorating conditions. Agnes, despite her 78 years, had refused to wait for better weather. Something in Mayor Thompson's threatening tone the previous day had convinced her that time was running short, that forces beyond their control were moving to reshape Redwater's future, whether its residents wanted change or not. Following Samuel's hand-drawn map proved more challenging than either of them had anticipated. Decades of flash floods and wind erosion had altered the landscape, moving rocks and carving new channels through the canyon floor. What had once been clear landmarks were now obscured or completely transformed. "There," Agnes said finally, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation that matched one of Samuel's more detailed sketches. The twin pillars, with the gap between them, he marked that as the starting point for the final measurements. Bear consulted the map, counting off paces from the pillars toward a spot Samuel had marked with careful compass bearings. The rain was falling harder now, plastering their clothes to their bodies and making the papers almost impossible to read. Agnes watched Bear dig in the location indicated by Samuel's measurements, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. What if they found nothing? What if 40 years of weather had destroyed whatever Samuel had tried to preserve? Or worse, what if what they found contradicted everything she believed about her husband's character and motivations? "Got something," Bear called out, his voice barely audible over the sound of rain on stone. He'd been digging for nearly an hour, working methodically through layers of sediment and debris. Now his shovel struck something that rang with the distinctive sound of metal on metal. Together, they cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal a large iron box, roughly the size of a traveling trunk. The metal was stained with rust, but still solid, its contents protected by Samuel's foresight in choosing durable materials and a location sheltered from the worst weather. Bear lifted the box with obvious effort. Whatever Samuel had buried weighed considerably more than a collection of papers and artifacts. They carried it between them to the shelter of an overhanging rock where Bear could examine the contents without exposing them to the driving rain. The box was secured with a simple latch, but no lock, typical of Samuel's trusting nature. When Bear lifted the lid, Agnes gasped at what they found inside. The cache contained far more than she'd expected, not just documents, but photographs, maps, and artifacts that represented a comprehensive archive of the territory's hidden history. At the top lay a letter addressed to "My beloved Agnes and the friend she will choose," written in Samuel's familiar handwriting. Agnes read the letter aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth I've spent years documenting has become your responsibility. What you'll find in this box represents the real story of how Redwater came to be, not the sanitized version in the history books, but the complicated, beautiful, and sometimes ugly truth about what happened when different peoples tried to build a life together in this harsh land." The letter went on to explain Samuel's systematic documentation of events the town's leadership preferred to forget: cooperation between white settlers and native tribes, interracial marriages and relationships, economic partnerships that crossed ethnic lines, and most explosively, evidence of government corruption in the original land grants that established the township. "The truth," Samuel had written, "is that Redwater succeeded not because of racial purity or superior civilization, but because people like Running Bear and Catherine Morrison proved that cooperation was possible even in the most difficult circumstances. But that truth threatens those who benefit from division and prejudice, so it has been systematically erased from official records." Bear was examining a collection of photographs that showed Redwater's early days in startling detail. Images of white and native families working together during harvest time, of the integrated school Catherine Morrison had operated before federal policy forced segregation, of the thriving trading post, where Running Bear had served as translator and mediator between cultures. "Look at this," Bear said, holding up a formal portrait that made Agnes's heart skip. The photograph showed a young white woman and a tall native man standing together, their hands joined in a gesture of obvious affection. But it wasn't the romantic pose that shocked Agnes. It was the faces looking back at her across the decades. "That's Catherine and Running Bear," Agnes whispered. "Your grandparents." But Samuel also photographed them. He documented their wedding ceremony. The implications were staggering. If Samuel had preserved photographic evidence of a legal marriage between Catherine Morrison and Running Bear, it would fundamentally challenge the narrative that their relationship was somehow illicit or temporary. More importantly, for Bear's situation, it would provide documentary proof of his legitimate claim not just to Agnes's property, but to a place in Redwater's founding history. But the most shocking discovery came when Agnes lifted a thick folder from the bottom of the box. Inside were land deeds, survey maps, and legal documents that told a story completely at odds with the official version of the township's establishment. "Bear," Agnes said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "According to these documents, Running Bear didn't just help individual settlers survive. He owned nearly a quarter of what's now Redwater Township. Legal ownership, purchased through proper channels and recorded with territorial authorities." Bear leaned over her shoulder, studying the papers with growing amazement. The documents showed a systematic pattern of land acquisition by Running Bear between 1871 and 1876, conducted through Catherine's legal assistance and funded by his work as a guide and translator for government survey teams. "The town council has been selling land they don't legally own," Bear said slowly. "If Running Bear's purchases were properly recorded, then his heirs, his descendants, have claim to property that's been changing hands for decades without proper title." Agnes felt the full weight of what they'd uncovered, settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Samuel's cache didn't just contain family history or sentimental artifacts. It held evidence of massive fraud that implicated nearly every prominent family in Redwater's power structure. Thunder crashed overhead, and through the driving rain they could see lights moving in the distance. Someone was coming up the canyon trail, multiple figures carrying lanterns despite the dangerous conditions. "We need to go," Bear said urgently, beginning to repack the most essential documents. "If the wrong people find us here with this evidence—" A gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, the sound unmistakable even over the storm. Agnes and Bear froze, understanding immediately that their discovery had not gone unnoticed. Someone had been watching, waiting for them to find Samuel's cache. "Mrs. Harrow, Mr. McCord," Sheriff Parker's voice carried clearly through the rain. "We need to talk." Bear quickly closed the box and hefted it to his shoulder. "There's another way out of the canyon," he whispered. "Follow me and stay low." As they picked their way through the rocks toward the back of the canyon, Agnes could hear more voices joining Parker's Mayor Thompson, at least 2 members of the town council, and others she didn't recognize. The search party was large and well-organized, suggesting they'd been planning this confrontation for some time. They knew, Agnes realized as they climbed higher into the rocks. Somehow they knew about Samuel's cache, knew we'd eventually come looking for it. "Or they've been watching us closely enough to predict our movements," Bear replied grimly. "Either way, we're in serious trouble." The rain was letting up slightly, but the rocks were treacherous with moisture and loose debris. Agnes struggled to keep pace with Bear's longer stride, her 78-year-old body protesting every step of their desperate flight. Behind them, the search party was spreading out, their lanterns creating an ominous constellation of light, moving steadily up the canyon. Agnes could hear dogs barking. They'd brought tracking animals to ensure no escape route remained open. "There," Bear said, pointing toward a narrow cleft in the rock face that was barely visible in the darkness. "We can get through there, but it's going to be tight." Agnes looked at the opening with dismay. Even in her youth, squeezing through such a narrow space would have been challenging. Now, with arthritis in her joints and decades of accumulated frailty, it seemed impossible. "You go," she said firmly. "Take the evidence and get it to someone who can use it properly. Don't let Samuel's sacrifice be for nothing." "I'm not leaving you," Bear replied with equal firmness. "We're in this together, remember? Partners in preserving the truth." The sound of voices was getting closer, and Agnes could make out individual words, now orders being given, search areas being assigned. They had perhaps minutes before the pursuit reached their current position. "Bear," Agnes said, gripping his arm with desperate strength, "promise me something. If we don't make it out of this, promise me you'll use that evidence to honor your grandparents' memory. Don't let them erase the truth about what Running Bear and Catherine built here." Before Bear could respond, another voice called out from much closer than they'd expected, close enough that Agnes could see the lantern light reflecting off wet rocks just below their hiding place. "I know you can hear me, Agnes," Mayor Thompson's voice carried clearly in the still air. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to talk about what you've found, work out an arrangement that benefits everyone." Agnes and Bear exchanged glances, both understanding that Thompson's conciliatory tone masked far more dangerous intentions. Men who brought guns and dogs to talks weren't interested in peaceful negotiations. The storm clouds were beginning to break apart, allowing moonlight to filter through the canyon. In a few more minutes, their hiding place would be clearly visible to anyone looking in their direction. Agnes took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 78 years of life and 40 years of marriage to a man who'd valued truth above comfort or safety. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd decided to stop running. "If you want to talk, then let's talk properly. Just you and me, face to face, like civilized people." Bear grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with alarm, but Agnes patted his hand reassuringly. Sometimes, she'd learned, the only way forward was through the heart of danger itself. The confrontation that followed would become the stuff of Redwater legend, though the versions told in later years would bear little resemblance to what actually happened that night in the canyon. Mayor Thompson emerged from the rocks below their position, his expensive suit soaked through, and his political composure badly frayed by the night's events. Behind him came Sheriff Parker and three men Agnes didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals whose presence suggested this had moved far beyond local politics. "Agnes," Thompson called up to her, "come down from there before you hurt yourself. We need to discuss the contents of that box like reasonable adults." Agnes remained where she was, 70 feet above the canyon floor, with Bear crouched protectively beside her. "From up here, Mr. Thompson, I can see quite clearly. And what I see is a group of armed men who seem awfully concerned about an old woman's family papers." "Those aren't just family papers, and you know it," Thompson replied, abandoning his conciliatory tone. "You've found documents that could complicate legitimate business transactions, important transactions that will bring prosperity to this entire community." "Prosperity for whom?" Agnes shot back. "For the families whose land you've been selling without proper title, for the people whose history you've been systematically erasing?" One of the strangers stepped forward, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Harrow, my name is Agent Morrison, Department of the Interior. The federal government has legitimate interests in this matter that supersede local concerns." Agnes felt Bear tense beside her. The arrival of federal agents transformed their situation from a local dispute into something far more dangerous. Men like Agent Morrison had the power to make problems disappear permanently. "What federal interests?" Agnes demanded. "Railroad development, territorial security, proper management of Indian affairs," Morrison replied smoothly. "The documents in that box represent outdated claims that could interfere with authorized development projects. For the good of the territory, they need to be properly disposed of." "Disposed of?" Agnes repeated. "You mean destroyed?" "I mean managed appropriately by people qualified to understand their implications." Agnes looked down at the faces, staring up at her local officials she'd known for decades, federal agents whose loyalty was to distant bureaucrats, men whose definition of progress required the erasure of inconvenient truths. For a moment, she felt the full weight of her age and isolation, the impossibility of standing against such overwhelming force. Then she thought of Samuel, carefully documenting the truth, even when it would have been easier to look away. Of Running Bear and Catherine, building a life together despite a world determined to keep them apart. Of all the stories she'd shared with Bear over the past months, stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. "Gentlemen," Agnes said, her voice carrying across the canyon with surprising strength, "I'm 78 years old. I've buried a husband, survived droughts and floods and Indian raids, and watched this territory grow from wilderness into something approaching civilization. And in all those years, I've learned one fundamental truth. When powerful men start talking about managing the evidence of their misdeeds, honest people had better start talking louder." She stood up slowly, Bear's steadying hand on her elbow, and faced the group below with the dignity of someone who decided to stop being afraid. "The documents in this box prove that Running Bear of the Kiowa Nation legally purchased nearly a quarter of what's now Redwater Township. They prove that he and Catherine Morrison were legally married in a ceremony witnessed and documented by respected members of this community. And they prove that the land deals you've been arranging for federal purchase are based on fraudulent titles." Agent Morrison's hand moved toward his coat, but Sheriff Parker grabbed his arm. "Let her finish," Parker said quietly. "She's earned that much." "Thank you, Sheriff," Agnes continued. "Samuel spent years documenting the real history of this place, not the sanitized version that makes everyone comfortable, but the complicated truth about how different peoples learned to live together. That truth is inconvenient for men who profit from division and prejudice, but it's still the truth." Bear rose beside her, the iron box balanced on his shoulder like a shield. "My name is Caleb McCord," he called down to the assembled men. "I'm the grandson of Running Bear and Catherine Morrison McCord, and the legal heir to the properties documented in this box. I'm also prepared to fight in federal court for every acre my grandfather purchased and every right he passed down to his descendants." The declaration hung in the night air like a challenge. Agnes saw Agent Morrison and Mayor Thompson exchange glances, their calculation obvious even in the darkness. They'd come expecting to intimidate an elderly widow and her drifter companion. Instead, they'd found legitimate heirs, armed with documentary evidence that could unravel decades of fraudulent transactions. "There's another option," Agent Morrison said finally. "A reasonable settlement that compensates all parties and avoids lengthy legal proceedings. Mr. McCord could receive fair market value for his inherited properties. Mrs. Harrow could be relocated to comfortable accommodations in town, and the development projects could proceed on schedule." "How much?" Bear asked bluntly. Morrison named a figure that made Agnes gasp. It was far more money than she'd seen in her entire lifetime, enough to ensure comfortable retirements for both of them. "And in exchange," Bear continued, "the contents of that box disappear forever. The complicated history it documents gets forgotten in favor of a simpler narrative that doesn't challenge existing property arrangements or business relationships." Agnes felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. The offer was generous, probably more than they could hope to win in years of legal battles. It would ensure her security for the rest of her life and give Bear the resources to build whatever future he chose. But it would also mean abandoning everything Samuel had worked to preserve, betraying the memory of people like Running Bear and Catherine, who'd fought for the right to be recognized as full human beings, deserving of dignity and respect. "No," Agnes said quietly, then louder. "No, the truth isn't for sale, gentlemen, not at any price." Bear nodded his agreement, and Agnes felt a surge of pride in the man he'd become, or perhaps the man he'd always been beneath the surface. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, as partners in something larger than their individual survival. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Agnes couldn't tell if reinforcements were coming for Thompson's group or if help was arriving for her and Bear. But as the hoofbeats grew louder, she realized it no longer mattered. The truth, once spoken, couldn't be unsaid, and sometimes that was victory enough. 6 months later, Agnes Harrow sat in her familiar rocking chair on the front porch, watching the morning sun paint Redwater's main street in shades of gold and possibility. The chair held the same comfortable creaks and familiar worn spots, but everything else about her world had transformed in ways she was still learning to understand. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up from the manuscript pages in her lap. Bear McCord walked up the path from town, his arms full of packages from Morrison's store, and his face bright with the kind of contentment Agnes had rarely seen in him during their early months together. "Mail came in on the morning train," Bear announced, settling his packages on the porch table and pulling an official-looking envelope from his coat pocket. "From the publishing house in Denver." Agnes accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from anticipation. After everything they'd been through, the simple act of receiving mail still felt like a small miracle. For months after their confrontation in the canyon, neither of them had been certain they'd live to see their project completed. The letter bore good news. The publishing house was pleased with the manuscript they'd submitted and wanted to proceed with printing The True History of Redwater, a documentary account by Agnes Harrow and Caleb McCord. More importantly, they'd found interest from academic institutions and historical societies throughout the territory, suggesting their work would reach far beyond the boundaries of their small community. "Listen to this," Agnes said, reading from the publisher's letter. "Your documentation of intercultural cooperation during the settlement period provides valuable insights into alternative models of frontier development. The photographic evidence you've preserved is particularly significant for scholars studying the often overlooked contributions of native peoples to territorial development. Bear smiled as he began unpacking supplies for their ongoing research. The iron box they'd recovered from Samuel's cache had yielded far more material than either of them had initially realized. What they'd thought was a comprehensive archive had proven to be only the beginning. Samuel's careful documentation had included references to other caches, other families with stories worth preserving, other evidence of the complicated truth about how the West had really been won. The months following their canyon confrontation had brought changes neither of them could have predicted. Agent Morrison's federal investigation had indeed moved forward, but not in the direction he'd originally intended. When Bear's legal claim to running Bear's properties had been validated by territorial courts, it had triggered a comprehensive review of land titles throughout the region. The resulting scandal had reached all the way to Washington, exposing a pattern of fraudulent transfers that implicated federal officials, local politicians, and business interests across multiple territories. Mayor Thompson had resigned in disgrace and left Redwater entirely. Sheriff Parker had been replaced by a younger man with less tolerance for the kind of corruption that had flourished under the old regime. Most surprisingly, several families whose property titles had been called into question had approached Bear and Agnes, seeking their help in documenting the legitimate history of their own claims. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by while you were in town," Agnes told Bear, as he arranged his writing materials on the small table they'd added to the porch for their work sessions. "She wants to contribute her grandmother's diary to our next volume. Apparently, it contains first-hand accounts of the cholera epidemic of 1878 that contradict some of the official medical reports." The success of their historical documentation project had given both Agnes and Bear something neither had expected to find at this stage of their lives: purpose that extended beyond their own immediate concerns. Agnes had discovered that her years of isolation had given her a unique perspective on community dynamics, while Bear's outsider status and mixed heritage allowed him to see patterns and connections that lifelong residents missed. Their partnership had also evolved in ways that surprised the town gossips who'd initially been scandalized by their friendship. Rather than the inappropriate romance some had predicted, Agnes and Bear had developed a relationship that transcended easy categorization. They were family in the deepest sense, not by blood or marriage, but by choice and mutual respect and shared commitment to something larger than themselves. Agnes looked up from the publisher's letter to study Bear's profile as he organized their research notes. At 35, he'd grown into the kind of man his grandparents would have been proud to claim: educated, principled, respected by those whose opinions mattered. His literacy had improved dramatically through months of intensive work on their manuscript, and his confidence in dealing with lawyers, publishers, and academic researchers had developed alongside his writing skills. "I've been thinking," Agnes said, setting the letter aside and picking up her knitting, "about what we should work on next." Bear looked up from his papers, eyebrows raised in question. "Sarah Mitchell mentioned that the territorial government is planning to establish formal archives for preserving historical documents," Agnes continued. "They're looking for people with experience in documentation and research to help organize the project." "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Agnes smiled, feeling the same excitement she'd experienced as a young bride contemplating the journey west. "I'm suggesting that two people who've proven rather good at uncovering inconvenient truths might be exactly what the territory needs to ensure its history gets preserved properly." The idea had been growing in her mind for weeks as letters arrived from historians, genealogists, and other communities interested in replicating their documentation methods. Their work had demonstrated that ordinary people could uncover and preserve stories that professional historians might overlook or deliberately ignore. Bear's answering smile lit up his entire face. "Mrs. Agnes Harrow, are you proposing that we become professional troublemakers?" "I'm proposing that we become professional truth-tellers," Agnes corrected. "There's a difference, though I admit the distinction might be lost on certain politicians." As they settled into their morning routine of reading, writing, and organizing the endless stream of documents that now flowed through their small home, Agnes felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with fame or recognition. The rocking chair still creaked with the same familiar rhythm, but now it was accompanied by the sound of Bear's pen scratching across paper and the rustle of correspondence from people across the territory who were discovering their own family stories worth preserving. Samuel would have approved, Agnes thought, as she watched Bear carefully transcribe another account of frontier cooperation that challenged official narratives. Her husband had always believed that the truth was worth pursuing regardless of the cost, and that ordinary people had both the right and the responsibility to preserve their own histories. The roses along the fence had survived their winter ordeal and were beginning to bloom again, their stubborn beauty a reminder that some things endure despite all attempts to destroy them. Like the flowers Samuel had planted as symbols of hope, the stories Agnes and Bear were preserving would outlast the people who'd tried to bury them. As the sun climbed higher over Redwater, painting the desert landscape in shades of promise and possibility, Agnes rocked gently in her chair and planned their next adventure in the endless, vital work of remembering truth.